We're broadcasting on Channel 9 as well as live streaming on Port Media's YouTube channel. You can find that by going to www.ncmhub.org and then clicking on the YouTube icon in the upper right-hand corner. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and I'm so pleased to welcome today's guests. Barbara Hopkinson is here to talk about issues of loss and grief during the pandemic and in general, and also to tell us about the organizations that she's founded to help lead families through the journey of grief, which she's been doing for 15 years. Later in the show, historian and baseball superfan Anthony Guerriero will be here to talk about the life and legacy of legendary Red Sox slugger Ted Williams. But first, let me introduce you to Barbara Hopkinson. She's a certified grief recovery method specialist. She's also a best-selling author and a retired IBM executive. She's a founder of a nonprofit organization, A Butterfly's Journey, and also of the local chapter of Compassionate Friends. In 2019, she received an award for being top professional in resilience after loss. And this year, she was named Empowered Woman of the Year by the International Association of Top Professionals. So, Barbara, first of all, just thank you so much for coming to the morning show and sharing your wisdom about grief and loss with us. I really appreciate it. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Oh, my pleasure, totally. Thank you. Well, I wanted to invite you on the show, Barbara, because the pandemic, of course, has brought all of us so many losses of different kinds and degrees, but all of those losses are significant, each of us as individuals, and all of them need, it seems to me, some kind of acknowledgement. I know that you have come to your expertise on loss and grief in the hardest possible way, Barbara, and I hope that we might begin today's interview with you just telling us about the pathway that led you toward devoting yourself to helping people process grief and find resilience in the face of loss.
Oh, sure. When I was in the corporate world, I lost all three of my children over time. Not all three. I have four. My remaining son is still alive, thankfully. But I had a miscarriage, and then I had two healthy boys, and then a full-term stillborn. And they grew up and were fine, but then my older son, Brent, went off. Actually, he wanted to be an Army pilot. He chose to go to military high school, and he was out at Arizona State University when he traded vehicles with a friend and with a motorcycle that was really way over his expertise. And anyway, he lost control of it, and so he lost his life at just after the age of 21. And then a year later, my 30-year marriage fell apart, and his brother was 19 at the time. He's now, Brad DeLibro owns Bob Lobster, and he's a successful chef, but we all went through quite a few struggles at the time. Later on, I married my second husband, Jim Hopkinson, and we had a great relationship for like 12 and a half years, and he had a widowmaker heart attack on his way to work one morning. So I became not only a bereaved mother, but a widow. So I started this work after my older son died back in 2000. He died in 2002. I founded the Compassionate Friends of Greater Newburyport in 2003, which is a support group for families that have lost a child, grandchild, or sibling. And then I wanted to do more, and I put out my first book, A Butterfly's Journey, in 2013, and started the nonprofit of the same name, and then got certified to be a grief recovery specialist in 2015. I kind of knew that helping others would help me heal, and I just wanted to do more because we don't talk much about grief in our culture, and there's not always a lot of support for it.
Well, that's for sure, Barbara, and yet people need to be able to talk about it, and that's just, a staggering amount of loss and grief that you've journeyed through on your own, and yet it's very inspiring to me that you channel that into the determination to find your own way through grief by helping others find their path through grief. So I give you huge credit for that. It's such an inspiring story. I want to learn more about the organizations that you founded and the grief recovery method that you're trained in and that you use. But I also first wanted to talk to you about what's happening around grief and loss these days. I was reading one article by an author who said that we're experiencing not just a coronavirus pandemic, but a pandemic of loss right now. The accumulation of loss that these extraordinarily altered lifestyles that we're all being forced to lead right now brings us new losses every day. The loss of social contacts, the loss of jobs, the loss of schools, the loss of graduations, the loss of rituals and ceremonies, and the loss of control over planning our lives and whatever version of normal we expected to have in our lives. You know, that list, it strikes me, is different for each of us, but each of us has a list of things, of losses we've been accumulating since mid-March. Barbara, how do you think these, one writer called them the non-death losses, for shorthand, I'll call them that. How do you think they're impactful on our state of being? And what happens if we don't recognize them as losses that we're accumulating all the time?
Yeah, I think one of I think to start, I'd like to basically say really the definition of grief is not only a normal and natural reaction to loss, but losses also that are a change in behavior, patterns of behavior. So it's not just about death, right? It's about any kind of losses. And the grief recovery method deals with that. I think they identify 43 kinds of loss, and I don't think that even includes maybe some of the losses we've encountered in the pandemic.
I think we've invented new ones.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot of fear, but there's a lot of helplessness, right? There's a lot of that hopelessness and helplessness that we're like, what is going on? How, we don't feel in control anymore. And that's very stressful. And when you ask about, what happens, a lot of times, one of the things, they have a term called STERBs, short-term energy relieving behaviors. And those are things like, eating and drinking and retail therapy,
absolutely.
Lots of different things that, we do comfort. That's why they call them comfort foods, right? So we do a lot of those kind of things. But there's a lot of stress, there's depression, there's, you have your future all planned out and all of a sudden it doesn't look the same anymore. So that all has an impact, and it's, if we don't recognize them as losses, we can't really deal with them. So if we can realize that we're going through some sort of loss and then take some appropriate action depending on what works for us. It might be meditation or exercise or journaling or walking in nature or therapy, or getting, some kind of help around these things.
Yeah. All of those things you just named are more constructive ways of directly helping with the feeling of loss and the helplessness than some of the things we might instinctively be drawn to, like some of the behaviors that you were naming, the retail therapy, which is not really therapy at all. It's more of a distraction. And we all, of course, wind up paying the price for the comfort food at some point.
Shopping.
So I wonder, and it strikes me that one of the things that is, I think distinctive about human beings, I'm struck by the list of, was it 43 types of loss?
Yeah.
And I think in addition to grieving things that we grieve, I think, things we never had but thought we might have. And I think often, we don't necessarily categorize those as losses, but a fantasy or something, expectation, something you've been imagining for your future. That's also a loss when it turns out that you aren't going to be able to have it. So we're very creative in the ways we generate loss. So I'm curious to find out, Barbara, with all these different kinds of losses, in your experience, is there a difference between the way that we grieve, again, what I'll call for shorthand a non-death loss, and grieving a death? What's similar and what's different for us about the way we grieve these different types of losses?
I think the similarities are probably things like the short-term energy relieving behaviors. We might react, we might result, use those even, in either case. We might be stressed or depressed, either kind of loss. I think some of the differences are probably around maybe the intensity of the loss and the feeling, or the length of duration for how long it affects you. And everybody's unique, right? So,
yes.
And every relationship is unique, and just like every loss, and what a loss in the pandemic of a job might mean something totally different to two different people, depending on how dependent they were on that job. So there's so much uniqueness around loss, regardless of whether it's loss of a loved one, which of course is typically more intense. But still, it can be pretty scary when you lose some of these things, especially around the pandemic, that have caused losses of jobs and income and future and weddings and, even graduations, right? At that age, you really want very badly to be able to celebrate that you've just put through so many years of hard work. So
that's right. That kind of ritual is part of how we signal to ourselves that we're moving into a new phase of life.
Right.
And I think that, fortunately, Newburyport and other cities and towns have been creative about finding ways to create rituals like a drive-through graduation or socially distant, but nonetheless, it's still not the same. I'm interested, and I like the way you focus on the extreme individuality of the way we process loss, because I think it's important. Somebody might lose a job and it's their sole source of income, and so that's a hugely significant loss for them. Somebody else might lose a job and they have a partner who has a good income, and so it lands on them in a different way. But I think it's important for people to, I guess, not compare and contrast, to honor your own losses, and not think that you shouldn't feel loss or grief because somebody else had a loss that looks similar on the outside, but your process of it on the inside is just as important and just as significant to name and find some way to cope with. So I appreciate.
And not so much judge, other people,
absolutely,
and compare it to yours, because you really don't know what they're going through, or what their relationship or what their situation is.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Well, it strikes me that another distinct feature of the losses that we're experiencing right now is we've talked about this a little bit, but it's a distinct feature of what our lives are like now, and that's the seeming felt endlessness of losses. And to me, this appears to happen in a couple of ways. One is the constant media coverage, of course, of the pandemic, and I'm not saying that they shouldn't be, but I'm saying it's in our face all the time. Right. And the other is the way that we're all watching, especially right now, that the coronavirus appears to be kind of whirling around the nation, kind of like a tornado, lighting here and there in different places. But it's a tornado that never runs out of steam, or shows no signs currently of running out of steam. And that also generates that feeling of endlessness and vulnerability. I think also generates its own distinct kind of loss for our time. And I wonder what your thoughts are about how can we cope then with what starts to feel like just a chronic, like our lives have become in some ways a chronic state of loss.
Yeah, and I have a little list of things from, especially around the grief recovery method, but also just in general. One of the most important things is to give voice to your feelings.
Yeah.
Really be able to talk about it. And that's difficult for people to do. And we're kind of discouraged to talk about our grief, especially if it's not grief of a death, a death kind of grief. Yeah. But yeah, you give voice to the feelings. If it is related to loved ones, really use their name. They have a great expression called "be a heart with ears" for each other, which is really just about listening, right?
I love that. A heart with ears.
Just be a heart with ears, so that you can and talk to your friends and family members about that and say, hey, look, that's just what I need right now, and then do the same for them. That helps a lot. Be cautious about the disturbs we talked about, because it's really easy to fall into a lot of those. There's a lot of myths about grief, which we may talk about at some point, but avoiding some of the myths, but trying to be optimistic and have gratitude. Find something every day that you can be grateful for. I have a good friend, Lauren Lamore, who has a gratitude practice and says, every day, basically say, what am I grateful for, and how does it make me feel? And then kind of a thank you, and just write that down, or a lot of books tell you, write a list of 10 things every day that you're grateful for. Because if you think about it, you can easily find things that you're grateful for, and it actually helps you. But one of the most important things is self-care. And we don't take care very well of ourselves. We don't care for ourselves very well when we're not feeling well or where we're in grief. Do the things like making sure you've got a little quiet time, taking that walk in nature, getting a massage, just being good to yourself, because you really can't be good for others unless you are taking care of yourself. But also, if you pamper yourself a little bit, it'll just make you feel a little bit better. There's just a whole list of these. There's more of them, of course, but the only other important one I would say is trust your gut. People have a lot of advice about grief and how long it should be and how you should feel. Don't listen to it.
Yeah.
The only one that knows how you're feeling is you.
Right.
And the only one that knows what works for you is you. So just try several things and take a couple of them and reuse the ones that feel like they work. And then every once in a while, try a new thing.
Yeah, that seems really wise to me, Barbara, especially you have to listen to yourself and what's going on, because the only way you'll be able to find what helps you and what works for you is by doing just that. You have to defer to your own inner instincts and wisdom. And I love the idea of ramping up your self-care at a time of loss, which I think a lot of goes against what a lot of people feel like they should do. So those are all very, very wise and helpful things to do. I appreciate that.
And one example of myself is I was in the corporate world. I was in a high pressure job, and we didn't talk at all about spirituality. But when my son died, I really needed to start to figure out kind of why. And so I got into that, and I got into energy healing, different kinds of energy healing, which I had never tried before. And it helped tremendously. I didn't know that. I didn't expect that. All kinds of it. It might be Reiki or polarity or acupuncture or just, shamanic massage or whatever. But anyway, that's something that I wasn't expecting, and an example of just keep an open mind about it.
Absolutely. And look for any modality that is the one that feels like it's a right fit for you.
Right.
Yeah. Well, something else I wanted to ask you about, because it's one of the more heartbreaking aspects of the changes that the pandemic has brought, is the unsettling and really heartbreaking stories about family members who haven't been able to make physical contact with their loved ones when they're in the hospital and are dying. People have been reduced to saying farewell via iPad with the intermediary of a nurse who can actually be in the room with their loved one. And Barbara, how do you think this impacts the bereaved and also the rest of us who hear about it?
That's a major impact. I mean, people come together when someone is sick and dying, and the person who's going through it gets a lot of support from that. So for that to be taken away is major. And then, of course, people not only couldn't be with their loved ones when they were sick and dying, they couldn't hold funerals afterwards.
Yeah.
And that's how you get together and comfort each other. I never understood, my heritage is Irish. I never understood the Irish wake until my father died. I lost both my parents when I was 32 and 47. But, and it was like, wow, now I get it. The ability to talk with each other and really comfort each other, and even be together to show pictures and tell stories. And of course you can do that with Zoom and that helps a little. But to be in person and be able to hug each other, is just so healing, especially at that first time. So I think it's major that has happened. And kudos to the wonderful healthcare people who helped at least provide some iPad contact.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've talked through iPad to my 93-year-old aunt, who's in Nebraska, but can't get any visitors, because of the situation. It makes a big difference to them. But yeah, it's a major impact. And the rest of us, I think, are frustrated and discouraged about that. We're also compassionate and feeling bad for all those people that are going through this, that have lost, especially there's a lot of elderly that have been lost in a lot of the various kinds of care facilities. It's hard. It's another thing, another layer of grief.
It is absolutely another layer of grief. Yeah. And you're right. Kudos to those healthcare workers who understand the need for the families to have some kind of contact and are willing to hold the iPads and make sure that there is some form of goodbye. Although, as you were just explaining, it doesn't provide the same kind of benefit and closure, I guess is the word that comes to my mind, as an in-person kind of funeral service where you can talk and hug. So,
a lot of them are delayed. The funerals are delayed for quite a while as well.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Right. And a lot of them, A lot of them are then they're very private services, very small, and that's different from the larger gathering. Which, and when I think about my parents' funerals, part of what helped me was seeing the people show up, the people who cared, feeling surrounded by a community, a fairly large community of people who knew my parents and cared. So just tough all around. Well, Barbara,
my son died. I was not only amazed at how many people came, but we did a sharing. I put in the obituary that we were going to do a sharing service because his ROTC buddies did that in Arizona for a service there. So when I came back, I put that in, and we went on for 2 hours, people telling stories about him. And a friend of mine, recorded it, Alan Smolowitz, Anna Smolowitz and her husband, Alan. And they recorded it, and now I probably watched that every year for 10 years after he died.
Of course.
I introduced my second husband, my son, who we didn't get to meet in person.
Oh,
so gosh. Like that you can't do, but that was invaluable.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Barbara, you've mentioned the grief recovery method, and I know that's what you found helpful and what you're trained in, and it's the method that you use to help the people that you work with through the journey of grief. So I wonder if you would tell us about what the grief recovery method is and how it's distinct from perhaps other ways of working with grief.
Yeah, it's supportive of things like support groups and therapy. It's not in conflict with those at all, but it's finite and it's action-based. So it is literally a 7-week class. I've got an advanced certification to do it one-on-one and over Zoom as well. The groups are done in an 8-week class. So it's finite. It's got a book and homework and tools. So it's action-based, but it's also evidence-based, which is kind of a scientific method to prove results. And it's the only grief recovery method that's evidence-based out there. But it helps you give voice. It helps you give voice to undelivered communications, which is a lot of the reasons you hang on to grief. Things like apologies and forgivenesses and other emotional statements that you didn't get to say to your loved one that you lost, or didn't get to express after a relationship broke up, or different things like that. So you actually go through. We talk about the myths of grief. We talk about the short-term energy relieving behaviors and how all this has impacted you. And then we do a loss history graph with all of your losses. And then we pick you pick a relationship, and we do a relationship graph of all the pluses and minuses, call those out into recovery components, and then actually write a letter with all of this undelivered communications that you would read out loud to a witness. So to me, you don't ever send that to the person if they're still alive or anything like that, because that would never work. Telling somebody you forgive them, they're not going to agree with that, and it won't do anything. By the way, I have to say that you forgive for yourself. You forgive someone else, you do it for you. You don't do it for them, because maybe they don't care. But it's not just that. It's you're trying to heal, not them. So a lot of people have a hard time with the thing forgiveness, but you're really doing it for yourself. But anyway, you go through that whole process, and we do it in 6 or 8 weeks, basically. And then it helps, it releases some things so that therapy works better. And it's really quite different than support, because support groups, you're talking about it, and that's great, but they're not action-based, right, typically.
Right. No, it sounds like it's designed to sort of have people engage in an active way with the process of grieving, so that they actually can experience some transforming of their energies along the way. It sounds very powerful and very creative, I must say. So
it's based on the health education series, but it's been around for 40 years. It was written by a bereaved dad, and then his partner, business partner, that updated it too. But it's used on 6 continents. There are thousands of people trained all over the world, so it's very proven.
Wow, that's just very intriguing. One of the things you mentioned just now and earlier were some of the myths about grief that are not that helpful to people. So I wonder, Barbara, if you could tell us about some of the myths, the mistaken kind of assumptions or expectations about grief and the grieving process, and how to counter those.
Sure. Well, let me just go through the 6 myths that they highlight. One is don't feel bad. Another is replace the loss, or grieve alone. Just give it time. be strong for others, and keep busy. Those are the myths. So, I mean, as you can see from all those, you can't tell somebody not to feel bad. They feel bad.
Yeah, I know.
They're feeling.
That's just suppressing your
right. You can't.
Not that helpful. Yeah, but I know that message is out there.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I mean, but that message is out there to kind of be stoic, so it's good to note. No,
yeah. Oh yeah,
do that. So
please don't ever tell a bereaved parent that at least they have other children. Or they
that's
replacing the loss, and that is
right.
That's like setting fire to someone,
Right.
and giving it time. Well, some people grieve, and work at it really good, and I was lucky to be successful with it. But some people it takes a long time. Keeping busy. That's okay, but it really delays the feelings, and they will come back and haunt you at some point if you don't deal with them. You have to go through grief. You cannot go around it. Mm-hmm. I had a mother come back once at 10 years in, but she had totally tried to avoid it, and it nailed her 10 years later, so. Yeah. But anyway.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's very helpful to go through those and provide a corrective for them. Barbara, I would hoping that you could tell us more about the organization that you founded, A Butterfly's Journey, and why you named it that.
Okay. I named it that because, again, when my older son died, I really sent me on a journey to figure out whether his spirit continued. Mm-hmm. And I have convinced myself through lots of things and signs from him that absolutely his spirit and everyone's spirit continues. Mm-hmm. And butterfly is really a global symbol of transition. And I think of it as it's a transition of our loved ones from a physical to a spiritual life, and a transition of our lives with them to be without them. So it's just and butterfly is kind of a symbol somewhere in most grief organizations. But the journey was really my healing and my journey to figure out all this, really the spiritual aspect. Mm-hmm. And now I think of his life, which helped me dramatically, by the way, to heal. When I stopped thinking of his life as a loss and started thinking of it as a gift. And wouldn't I rather, if I had to have never known him, choose to never have known him, or to lose him again at 21 years, I'd do it again in a heartbeat. Yeah. And so that helped me. So now when I think of him, I think of all the mother-son trips and the crazy days all day on roller coasters and all over the country and things like that, as opposed to he talked me into a bungee jump one time. We did a lot of crazy fun things together. So that's what I think of when I think of him now, not the pain and the loss.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And you're right, the metamorphosis of the butterfly seems like just a perfect analogy for the kind of transformation that you're describing, your own and that you see with other people. Well, there's another organization you founded, the local chapter of Compassionate Friends, which is a national organization. Could you tell us something about what Compassionate Friends is for?
Yes, and just real quickly on A Butterfly's Journey, I just want to mention the 3 services. So we have a free online resource center with hundreds of broad-based resources, not just belonging to A Butterfly's Journey, which is helpful for anybody 24/7. And then I do the grief recovery method classes, and I do these photo shoots called Faces of Resilience. So we'll get back to that, but they're helpful. And then the Compassionate Friends, I started a year after my older son died, and it's a support group for families that have lost a child, grandchild, or sibling. So we have been doing that in person, but since March, we've been doing it on Zoom, the old Zoom meetings. And so normally that's for anybody that can drive to me, but the Compassionate Friends US is the largest grief organization in the world. There's over 600 chapters all over the US. It's all peer-based and volunteer-based. So it's a peer support group where people are talking about their loss with each other. Which is very helpful, and you make friends and like-minded friends and things like that, which is very helpful.
Yeah, well,
stages. Yeah.
Well, Barbara, I know you've been through this. So, what are the distinct challenges of losing a child for a parent?
I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy.
Yeah.
And again, I don't mean to compare because everybody's loss is brutal to them, but it's the loss of the future. When you have a child and you have in mind for them this whole future, my son was about to, he had just passed his written test to be an Army aviator. He was getting engaged. and they both loved kids, and she had twins on both sides of her family. In my mind, I'm thinking, oh, great, twin grandchildren, all this stuff.
Yeah, sure.
You lose the future, and it's out of order. It's out of the natural order of things.
Yeah.
As hard as it is, you expect your parents to die before you.
Mm-hmm.
And depending on the situation with your siblings, they may or may not, but you do not expect your children to die before you.
Yeah.
So it's such a shock, no matter how they died. It guts you like a fish.
Yeah.
It really, yeah. So you just have to work through it, but you really do need to reach out. You need some kind of help through it, because it's brutal.
And that's what Compassionate Friends is for, people who will understand from their own experience just the absolute devastation of the loss. Yeah. So
and they have a national conference every year, and normally it's in person. This year it's going to be online, July 31st through August 2nd.
Oh, good to know.
They even do a walk to remember, but people can go to compassionatefriends.org.
Okay, good to know.
And get help. They also have Facebook groups for different types of loss. And they're doing that conference, which you can just register for, pretty easily.
Oh, excellent. Good to know about. Well, you mentioned Faces of Resilience, and I did want to learn more about that, these extraordinary and impactful photographs that you take with a professional photographer. So tell us a little bit about the Faces of Resilience, and there's a book of them as well, Barbara. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I got the idea from seeing people writing on their skin in a different context. And I thought, oh my God, it's so difficult to talk about grief, and especially for parents that have lost a child. People tend to avoid them. I think because they don't know what to say to them. Sometimes it's probably they can't think about it in the context of their own lives. So they're running away from them in supermarkets and things. And so they don't get to express themselves or talk about it enough. And that's the most healing thing you can do. So I started bringing a mobile photo shoot, which is we bring a backdrop and lights, a photographer, camera, the whole bit, to these grief events. And it was all over the country since 2015, but last year I took it international to London, Canada, and the Caribbean. And we actually take photos of people, and they express themselves about their grief, and we write on their skin with washable magic markers. And then we edit that photo professionally and send it to them. So when they do it, it's very cathartic. It's visceral, right? Because it's on your skin. It's cathartic to express themselves. And then it is a catalyst for them to talk about their grief when they get the photo afterwards. And I know my son is on the cover, so we did come out. The book is called Faces of Resilience. It's available on Amazon. That was the first photo book that we did, and I want to be able to do one in different themes later on. But my son Brad is on the cover. And he's got an issue on his hands. And the interesting thing about that is I did not choose him to do that. And at the time, my daughter-in-law, not his wife, but my another daughter-in-law, Renee, was my staff photographer. And I sent 200 pictures to the publisher, and she chose the cover. She chose my son and daughter-in-law for the front and back covers, having no idea that they were related to me at all.
Interesting.
But yeah.
Well, I encourage people to get the book, because they're very, very powerful photographs, and the people in them, there's a seriousness, of course, but there's also a power. These look like empowered people, strong. And that comes through just screams out loud and clear, the aura. So they're very powerful photographs, and what a creative idea to do that, Barbara.
Thank you. And there's a Barbara on my site, which is, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, no, I just wanted to thank you. I've learned so much. You have much wisdom to offer, and I really, really appreciate your coming on the morning show to share your wisdom with us. My final question is, how can people find you?
Okay, well, my site is abutterfliesjourney.org, and that's FLYS is possessive, not plural. And the phone number is 617-410-6309, and the email is info@abutterfliesjourney.org. And again,
Wonderful.
There's a free resource center, and there's a photo gallery, so that it's organized by relationship and type of loss, so people don't have to feel so alone. And then books are on Amazon.
It is a very abundant website. Having gone online to find it, there's so much there. There's something there for anybody who's experiencing just about any kind of loss. Thank you so much, Barbara. It's been a joy to have you here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mary. I've enjoyed it as well.
Okay, you take care now too. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Well, all right, everybody. Now we're going to welcome our next guest. Let's see if we can get Anthony Guerriero online. Anthony is an historian and a baseball super fan, and he is a good friend of the morning show. This is his third time on the show. He's been on in the past to talk about Thomas Jefferson and some of the perhaps unexpected things about Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, not only the author of the Declaration of Independence, but a foodie as well, who helped bring us Parmesan and ice cream. So thank you, Thomas Jefferson. And also more recently, Jackie Robinson, a trailblazer and civil rights advocate, as well as an outstanding athlete. So Anthony, welcome.
Hey,
how nice to have you back on the morning show. Good to see your face.
Good to see you, and thank you very much, as always, for the opportunity. Play ball.
Yeah, you know, I'm thinking that there's a lot of, we've been talking about loss, and of course the loss of sports
Right.
Has been consuming the country, and it's not clear when it will be over. And of course, baseball is the American pastime, so good to have you here to fill in a little bit of that gap with some lore about Ted Williams. So, you know, I know that American history is your passion, Anthony, and we had Jackie Robinson before. We have another baseball story here. So why a story about Ted Williams, and why now?
Well, this is a unique time. And 100 years ago, during the Spanish flu influenza pandemic, the last public event in Boston in 1918 was the last game of the 1918 World Series.
Oh, I had no idea. How interesting.
And there are pictures of baseball players wearing masks back then, 100 years ago. And sports are so ingrained into American society. It's an escape. And the idea of this whole idea of play in a person's life that we know as from a young child and again as an adult, has really been taken away from it. It's been redefined. I know as my son, my 5-year-old son, he can't go out and play with his friends. He can't go to the playground and the schoolyard. And it's really, as an only child, I feel bad for him because he's a soloist. So having sports maybe come back into the fray, which is still in doubt, is so important. And baseball really reflects America with its how it's changed. It's been around since colonial period time. It was known as town ball, and it's watched changes. It led American society with Jackie Robinson. It gave immigrants an opportunity to be equal, play equally on a level playing field. And we've had great stars throughout its history that represented every race and creed. So it's so important, and particularly in New England with the Boston Red Sox.
Absolutely. And why Ted Williams? Well,
you know, to your point, Ted Williams is a large, looming, mythical character in New England. I was a little boy in the 70s and 80s, and my favorite baseball player was Carl Yastrzemski, you know, the hero of the 67 team, who succeeded Ted Williams and became a Hall of Famer in his own right. And Williams is just this whole, the more I read about him, the more I studied him, this mythical character. And as time passes, particularly after his passing, almost 20 years ago, he just becomes a larger-than-life character and a person with one ambition, to be the greatest hitter of all time. And he accomplished that. So how many people in lives really focus on one particular thing and become an expert at it? He, you know, his daughter Claudia said, you know, he took one aspect of the game and perfected it. And he did. And there's also, he's from, you know, he's a New England treasure. You're talking about when the Red Sox won the World Series in '04. It meant so much to everybody, and they brought the World Series trophy to every New England state. Well, you talk about the New England states focusing on Ted Williams, and back during his heyday of playing in the 30s and 40s and 50s, there's probably about 9 newspapers. I mean, Mary, you might remember the Globe had an morning and evening edition.
Yeah, it was a big deal. The curse had been overcome.
Yes.
So it was huge.
And he was the only name in town. You know, so in the late 40s and in the 50s, there was nobody else. There were no Celtics. There were no Bruins. I mean, there was second-tier teams. The Patriots didn't exist. And it was just about Ted Williams. So your hopes and fears, everything rested on him. And he became this larger than life character. So he was a great hitter, served in the military. So all these aspects of him just made him into this, a mythical character.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I didn't grow up in this area, so I didn't realize that for the decades you just identified, there weren't other professional sports team. It was all Red Sox all the time,
That's right.
Which I'm sure must have made the curse even harder to bear because it was the only hope for a championship. And it is also extraordinary. I like the way you put it, how many people set out to, master one specific thing and then do it. And he did, because his batting average was like more than 400. I mean, nobody bats like that anymore.
No.
And they haven't for a long time,
No.
if I'm correct. Is that accurate, Anthony?
Yeah, I mean, he's the last man to hit 400. That was 406 in that great season in 1941. And the one thing I like about Williams is that he took every challenge and never was afraid of one. He went head on. He had an opportunity. His manager, who was Joe Cronin, another Hall of Famer, said, you know what, your batting average is 3.999. You can sit out these games against the Kansas City A's and sit it out, and they'll just round it off. And Williams said, no way, I'm gonna go for it. And I think he was 4 for 8 that day, and just went head on. And the catcher said to Williams when he got up his first time at bat, he says, Mr. Mack told us not to give you anything today. We're gonna pitch to you. And Williams appreciated that. And I think that if Williams didn't hit 406, he'd be upset, but he'd say, hey, listen, I gave it a shot. He didn't shy away from anything. And I think that's really something that says something about his character, because he was such a complex person. Mm-hmm. And he took hitting, he was different. I mean, he boned his bats. He got a bat and he rubbed it against a bone to bone it. He heated his bats to get the moisture out. And he was Ben Bradley Jr. wrote a great book on Ted Williams, talks about how he pioneered using a lighter bat. A lot of big league ball players and hitters like Jimmy Fox and Hank Greenberg and Babe Ruth used a heavier bat. And Williams said, no, I need to get better bat speed and better bat coordination. And he pioneered using a lighter bat, which is being used today, and also adjusting your swing on an uplift, which is being pioneered today. So he's way ahead of his time.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned him being, I think you used the phrase, a complicated character.
Complicated man, yeah.
Complicated man. Can you say more about what you mean by that?
Yeah, so, I mean, I think that Ted Williams grew up really poor. And I'm paraphrasing this, but he could be considered the first latchkey kid. So his parents he loved his parents, but they weren't there to support him. He didn't have the nuclear family unit that we think that is today. So he and his brother Danny, they came home, and there were plenty of times that he came home, no one was there. He was waiting outside the porch. He was hungry. And so he had this idea, I'm going to play baseball. When he realized that he could compete with all the kids, he did. Married 3 times, not a great husband, he admitted that. Had 3 kids, admitted that he wasn't the perfect father. But there were certain things of his life that he just focused on. And, he was... his first season, I mean, he's famous for not tipping his cap to the fans of Boston. But his rookie season, he was extraordinary. He had a tremendous rookie season, the greatest rookie season in the history of the game. And he dropped his hat all the time. And then that changed when the sports writers started getting onto him on his second season. Fought in 2 wars. Was an aviation pilot and lost 5 years of service, more than anybody else. And in terms of perfectionism, and we wonder if it's obsessive compulsive behavior, he's in 2 fishing Hall of Fames, both for saltwater and freshwater. So,
I did not know that.
Right, so I mean,
that's extraordinary.
and when you go fish, and I just started, right? It's a wonderful thing, but fishing forces you to be patient. And no one, and then to be a great hitter, you need to be disciplined at the plate, and you need to be patient. And Ted Williams was all that. He was a terrific aviator. He was a great naval fighter pilot. And, he was John Glenn's wingman. And Glenn said that he was one of the best pilots he ever flew with. So you have all these different aspects of his life. And he is, as Bob Costas and others said, he is the real John Wayne. He really is
Yeah,
the real. He's
yeah.
what John Wayne played in the movie.
Yeah, yeah, he had enough talent for 10 heroes.
That's right. That's right.
That's remarkable. It really is. Well, you mentioned one book about Ted Williams earlier. Do you have favorite books about Ted Williams that you've consulted that you'd recommend to people?
Yeah, and I actually have them here. So there's a couple of books. So Underwood and Williams worked on a book called My Turn of Bat that came out in '69, and then it was revised, I think, in the '80s. So that's a pretty good biography, or semi-autobiography. My Turn of Bat, which came out by Underwood as well, which is pretty good. Ben Bradley's book that came out 7 years ago, The Kid, The Immortal Life of Ted Williams, is a thick book, but it's a great read. And then what I like is by local authors Dick Johnson and Glenn Stout from the New England Museum. A bunch of essays and photos. That came out about 20 years ago. And it's Ted Williams, A Portrait in Words and Pictures. So it's a great fun read. And it has a great collection of photos and short stories on Williams. And I think that's a good coffee table book, if you want to call it.
Excellent. Yeah. So there's a variety of reads and photos for readers of every level of taste. So, I wanted to ask you, because I believe that, Ted Williams, he was a Red Sox during the span of the curse. So he never got to go to a World Series. And how did he feel about that?
He did go to World Series.
Oh, he did. Oh, sorry, I misunderstood what I was reading.
So the one thing in his career that always haunted him was he played in one World Series and didn't perform well. So right after the war, the Red Sox had a dream season in 1946. So you have all these players coming back to the game, but particularly the Red Sox with Johnny Pesky and Hall of Famer Bobby Doerr and Don DiMaggio. Good pitching. So they finally had a team around Williams that was hitting on all the cylinders. 104 games. That was the most since the 2018. Surpassed that. And Williams was MVP of that season. It was a dream season. And in preparation to the World Series, they competed against a team of Major League All-Stars. And Williams got hit in the elbow.
Oh.
And the elbow ballooned. And didn't know if he could play again. He'd be able to play in the World Series, and he did. He toughed it out. Hit only 200, and there are plenty of opportunities for him to be clutch, and he didn't. And that World Series is known for the famous run by Enos Slaughter to home plate, and Johnny Pesky supposedly holding the ball, which is unfair. But Williams never got another chance. So they had great teams in 48, 49, and then 50. They were competitive and lost to the Yankees and the Indians respectively. But he never got a shot. And, when you talk about all these other players like Babe Ruth and DiMaggio and Mantle, those great Yankee teams from the 40s into the 50s, they had the supporting cast. Ted Williams, it was just Ted Williams. The Red Sox of the 1950s, they call it the country club team. They were adequate ball players. I mean, you had bright spots and Jimmy Pearsall, Jackie Jensen won an MVP in '58, but there was nothing to write home about, Mary.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I wanted to ask you if you think of let's call it the Mount Everest of baseball icons, and Anthony, where does Ted Williams rank, and why?
He's right up there, Mary. I mean, I think that he's in the top 4, top 5. I mean, I think that Babe Ruth is the head of that, because he was such a game changer. He's just a monumental presence in the game. I think my friend Jackie Robinson, because how he changed the game and what he went through. And I think Williams is right there. I mean, I think you're talking about the players that had such a lasting impact in Ruth and Robinson. Ty Cobb was probably the greatest ball player of the dead ball era before 1920. And Williams is right there. I mean, I think the Williams story is the what if story, right? Which is famous. If he didn't lose those 5 years, and he lost over 700 games, where would he have been? Because he averaged 36 home runs annually. He had a lifetime average of 344, which is 4th best. So he's in the top 4, top 5. And like I said earlier, time has really been kind to him. I mean, he was mythical during that period of time that he played and he lived. But as time has passed, more attention, you're like, my God, he was unbelievable. And the more I read, the more I believe that if he wanted to go up to Ben and says, I'm going to hit a double and 2 home runs today, he could do it. He could hit whatever he wanted to hit.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned that he lost those 7 years, and he was in World War II. Yep. How did it happen that he got called back to go into the Korean War again? Why a second call-up, Anthony?
Yeah, it's a unique and strange story, Mary, and that's a great question. So Williams finished the 42 season. So after Pearl Harbor, you had this massive exodus of great ball players. Hank Greenberg, Bob Feller, his own teammates, and Bobby Doerr and Johnny Pesky, and actually Mo Berg, the catcher who was a famous spy. So Williams was in the service after the 42 season for 2 years, and then had his orders to go to the Pacific, and then the war ended. After that time, he stayed in the reserve. So you have to remember that he was a naval aviator. Mm-hmm. And so he stayed in the reserves, and at that point, it was an opportunity to remain active and make some extra money. And then when Korea came, they didn't have enough pilots. The military had demilitarized after World War II. And they didn't have enough pilots. And he got called up, he challenged it, and he went and fought and went in the early 50s and went over there to Korea and performed admirably and was a captain in the Marines. He loved the Marines. He loved everything about being a Marine. And it was just an unfortunate set of circumstances that, he was in the reserves, and those reserves were to provide support, and he got called up. A tough pill to swallow.
Extraordinary ball player, extraordinary patriot as well, clearly. So as a kind of bringing things together question, Anthony, what's the moral of the Ted Williams story?
That's a great thing. I think that the moral of the Ted Williams story is you can achieve anything. And that's the great thing about this country and the great thing about baseball. I mean, he believed that baseball gave you an opportunity to be better than somebody else because an equal playing field. And Williams was such a complex character, and he was a perfectionist, and he thought about hitting and practiced hitting all the time. Not coming from a nuclear family and not having that sport, his parents never saw him play a professional baseball game. So I think that, that definitely played into it. He was also a racial pioneer. I mean, and when he was first ballot Hall of Famer. When he went in his Hall of Fame speech, which is really important, that's forgotten a lot, is that he said he hoped that Negro League ball players like Satchel Paige and Josh Gibson would get the opportunity to be in the Hall of Fame, even though they didn't get the opportunity to play Major League Baseball, which is unfortunate. And he understood about racial discrimination because he was Mexican-American. His mother was a Mexican-American. So he understood that. And he's such a complex character. So he's more than the ball player, but a mythical one. And, it's funny, his Red Sox debut in April 15th, 1939, happened to be my beloved mother's birthday. And my mother was a big Williams fan. And my father naturally was a DiMaggio fan because he was Italian. So that was always an interesting
Well, you have to find balance then.
That's right, yeah.
So, well, Anthony, such an extraordinary story and such an extraordinary human being, and you have such a gift for bringing these historical characters alive. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
We've discussed the possibility that you might come back again later in the summer. Any chance of a preview of a coming attraction for Mo Berg?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, Mo Berg's last season, he was a utility catcher for the Boston Red Sox, was 1939, and that coincided with Williams' rookie year. And Mo Berg was a college-educated man, which was unheard of for a lot of ball players back in the 20s and 30s. Was an adequate backup, but brilliant. Was a linguist, spoke several languages, and as Casey Stengel once said, couldn't hit in any of them. But he too was a very complex man, and was recruited by the OSS, which was the forerunner to the FBI, to be a spy in World War II, and did some work in Japan prior to Pearl Harbor, and then was on a mission to find out if the Germans had the atomic bomb.
Wow.
So it's an unbelievable story. And Mary, if it's all right, I'm going to put my pitch in that maybe the Red Sox will retire his number.
Maybe, yeah.
You know, he like Williams and others, he truly is an American hero.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I hope you'll come back later in the summer. That sounds like a fascinating story, Anthony. Anthony, thank you so much. It's always a joy to have you on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thank you,
so thanks for telling us about Ted Williams. Just such an intriguing human being and a man of, as I said, enough accomplishment to be 10 different heroic figures. So thank you, Anthony. It was great to have you here. Good to see you.
Same
and hopefully
here,
we'll see you again later in the summer. I'll look forward to that.
Absolutely. Bye, Mary. Take care.
Bye-bye. All right. Well, thanks for watching, everybody. That's it for today's show. I hope you'll join us next Thursday on the morning show, when I'm pleased to report that my guest will be Joan Whitlow, the Executive Director of the Custom House Maritime Museum, as well as Sean Palmetier, who's the Assistant Director and Curator of the museum. And they're going to fill us in about the renovations that have been happening behind the scenes while the museum was closed during the shutdown. They're also going to talk about the current new featured exhibit, Entertainment for Man and Horse, Victuals, Libations, and Distractions in an Early American Tavern. And my other guest next week will be Reverend Joan McPherson of Main Street Congregational Church in Amesbury. And she has a very straightforward and compelling way of describing the meaning of systemic racism and the way it's a barrier to justice for all of us, and some ideas about what we can do about it. So I hope you'll join us next week, everybody. If you missed part of today's show, it'll be available for viewing on the Port Media YouTube channel playlist for the morning show. Just go to www.ncmhub.org and click on the YouTube icon and then look for the playlist for the morning show. Each show also airs on WJOP FM 96.3 on Friday mornings at 8 a.m. and then again the following Tuesday at 4 p.m. and Wednesday at 3 p.m. And will be also available as a podcast on the SoundCloud. Again, just go to www.ncmhub.org and click on the little cloud icon in the upper right-hand corner. That's it for today, everybody. I hope you have a wonderful week, and we'll see you back next Thursday morning at 9 a.m. Thanks, everybody. Bye.